I figure that most good stories don't have a clear beginning or a natural end. They're just places where we start talking and others where we stop. This story is no different from others in that regard. I've collected the thoughts and recorded them, mostly just in the order of my recollection. One thing I can say for sure, the best of my ability, what I'm describing actually happened. These are true events. Stories called Cinnamon Rolls from the Halls of Karma. To memory, the event started during a late autumn evening in Rick's bedroom. Rick and I were fast friends and always hanging out together. Bruce was also present, but he just happened to be the guy who was in the room at the moment when things started to happen. The energy required to make something happen out of nothing was almost tangible in the atmosphere that evening. Thoughts of spending another winter in Chicago had us dreaming of warmer climates. We warmed ourselves with a pact to travel south for the winter, take on a trip to sunny southern Mexico. This was to be no ordinary road trip. It would be a trip to make Jack Kerouac stand up and take notice. The plan was a 36,000-mile one-way marathon to Guatemala in a puke green 1961 Valiant. We sensed that our plans were special, but had no idea how significant they were until a knock came to the door. It was Rick's mother with a Christmas present from his aunt in Malibu, California. After a short delay used for fanning our pot smoke out the window, Rick opened the door enough to accept the present and hustled his mom away down the hall. What we found in the box was the first of a series of psychic shocks connected to our plans. The present was a hardbound book on archaeological sites of Mexico. Since we had just decided that we were leaving on a trip to Mexico, we saw the book as a very good omen. It did cross my mind at the time that it was a bit improbable for his aunt to send us a relevant book mailed a week before we had made plans to travel to the land about which the book was written. I decided that some things will just never be understood and started to help with a shopping list for the trip. It didn't take us long to figure out that the supplies and the repair to the Valiant far exceeded our funds. If it had been my call, I would have decided that it had been a nice pipe dream, but we were broke, and we'll be spending one more long winter in the snowdrifts of Chicago. Rick, on the other hand, had other ideas. His parents were wealthy, plus they had accounts with the auto shop and the sporting goods store in town. Not to mention they had credit cards just laying around the place. I wasn't too sure about this approach, but Rick was a pro at dipping into his parents' funds without making too many waves. Bruce had been brought up in the streets of Chicago by blue-collar parents with no great economic advantages. He had made his way in Chicago by his wits and seemed to be getting a charge out of the fact that we were planning to rip off just about everything we needed for the journey from Rick's parents. The next morning, Rick moved with the purpose of a Midwestern thunderstorm as he dropped the car at the garage for repairs, and then we headed to the sporting goods store to charge our camping goods. The credit card came in handy for filling the trunk with every imaginable form of dry or canned food. It was enough to last for months, and it turned out that it was going to be a real good idea in the long run. By the next morning, We were outfitted and heading for California and on the way to sunny Mexico. It would be days before Rick's parents realized that they had paid for our expedition. If Rick wasn't worried, why should I care about his family relations? Bruce had never been out of Chicago in his life. It seemed to me that he was more excited about ripping off the rich folks than about the journey. In retrospect, it seems I may have been correct. The trip seemed normal enough as we headed out through St. Louis and the gate to the west. Things didn't start getting strange until we decided to take a trip down Old Highway 66. It left Illinois with a fatal flaw in the Valiant that would eventually bring us in touch with the reality of our situation. The car had a cracked leaf spring in the passenger rear. Rick knew this, but he also knew that we had to get out of town before his parents got an inkling of how much money we had charged to their accounts. The compromise was to pack a new spring in the truck and hit the road as fast as possible. The waters of El Reno, Oklahoma. I'm pretty sure that Rick, Bruce, and I witnessed a miracle while driving down Old Highway 66 near El Reno, Oklahoma. The general look and lay of the land made us nervous. The speech patterns of the locals left three boys from Chicago feeling that they had just entered the movie Deliverance. Didn't help matters that Bruce kept blowing the Deliverance theme on his harmonica whenever he spotted a guy in bib overalls. Before we were halfway across the state, we started to profess fear and anger for Oklahoma, and were worried for our personal safety. We had nothing in particular to fear from the residents of Oklahoma, but we had convinced ourselves that the denizens of this state were dangerous savages. Our fear for all things Okie was really building to a head as we drove through the gloomy drizzle in El Reno, Oklahoma on a Sunday morning. The town was full of dripping gray emptiness, and we were filled with sudden apprehension as a stoplight turned from green to red. Rick quickly hit the brake, fearing that a small-town speed trap might land us in a jail cell filled with local color if we ran the stoplight. As the Valiant came to a stop, we heard a sudden crack in the rear, and the car sank by 6 inches on the right-hand side. The spring had broken. Why, of all places, had the spring decided to break on a Sunday in El Reno, Oklahoma? We were all positive that our doom was sealed. We were sure the local Okies would not only perform acts of sodomy on us, but they would probably barbecue and eat us during the next church supper. Worse, even if they decided to let us alone, after having their fun, every business in town was closed on Sunday. Where were we going to get Preparation H? Just before Bruce started shouting insults out the windows of the car, we spotted an open filling station. The owner told us that his mechanic was off work today, but we were welcome to use the bay in his garage if we wanted to do the repair to the car ourselves. This was not what we had expected to hear from the savages in the wilds of Oklahoma. But perhaps there is a bit of good in every crowd. I was the only guy in the car who had any degree of automotive knowledge, so I started on the repairs while Bruce passed me tools and kept an eye out for locals. Rick took up his post on the trunk of the Valiant and picking Woody Guthrie songs on a Martin D28 guitar. It never occurred to us that Woody had been born just a few miles away in Oklahoma. What did occur to me was that Rick had purchased a leaf spring for the car, but had forgotten to buy a new shackle. The old shackle was junk, and it would need to be replaced. We were beginning to feel that our luck had run out, and when the garage owner suggested that we go ask nice at the back door of the Chrysler dealer. Turned out that they were officially closed, but they had an inventory crew working inside that just might be able to help us. Rick and I knocked on the door and explained ourselves to the bewildered-looking young man who opened the door wide and invited us in. Once they heard our story, they explained that they really didn't know much about auto parts, but they would try to help us. Claiming that these boys helped us was short of what actually occurred. The men dropped everything and began swarming over the shelves, looking at every box for something that resembled the broken shackle in my hand. After 20 minutes of searching, the inventory crew returned to us, sweating, apologetic, and empty-handed. I can't recall another time when someone told me they were sorry that they couldn't help, and really showed in such an honest fashion. Rick and I were really impressed. Unfortunately, we were no closer to getting out of Oklahoma and on to Mexico way. We returned to the garage and told our tale of woe to the shopkeeper. He seemed to have an ace in the hole. He exclaimed, "We will build a new shackle." Now, I'm used to my grandfather repairing things by making something out of nothing, but this was El Rio, Oklahoma, and everything was closed on Sundays. How would we find the materials? No problem, the garage owner says. My cousin owns the hardware store, and I can get him to let us in. This seemed to be getting a bit strange, but whatever. I returned to changing out the broken spring. Well, Bruce continues to watch for hungry locals. Within an hour, the guy returns with steel band irons for the shackle straps, large bolts with washers, and nuts to use through the frame mount and the spring eye. Using a vise, a drill, and a hacksaw, he fabricates a good representation of a Chrysler spring shackle, just as I finished putting the torque on the final bolt. When I mention that we will need rubber bushings for the spring eye, the guy sends shivers up Bruce's spine by whipping out a large folding hunting knife. Instead of gutting the kid from Chicago, he turns to an old truck inner tube and cuts it into strips, wraps them around the shackle bolts, hands it to me with a big Oklahoma grin, and explains, "There's your bushing." I figure it's good enough to get us out of Oklahoma, and I take it with an honest thank you. His smile's rubbing off on me, I think, as I return to working on that car. Rick goes back to his position, sitting on the trunk and playing guitar, while Bruce continues to hand me tools and watch for locals. It was almost lunchtime by now. We just been feeding off something stashed in the trunk and washing it down with local water. I was near finished with the spring. The water tasted pretty good. I asked Bruce if he would fill all of our water bottles, canteens, and the desert water bag with it. As Bruce returned with the water, I crawled out from underneath the Valiant and announced that the car was once again ready to travel. Rick exclaims, "Far out, man!" Then he spins around quickly with his guitar and breaks the window out of the garage door. That was a real deflation for everybody. Kind of knocked us off our roll. Now it was our turn to be truly sorry about the situation. These folks had done everything possible to help us, and in return for the favor, we broke the window. The garage owner announces he wasn't going to charge us anything at all, but since we broke the glass, we'd have to pay up $5 so he could repair it. I was pretty sure Bruce was about to bolt, but I could see his muscles relax as Rick peeled off a $5 bill into the man's hand and apologized for the accident with honest sincerity we had grown to expect in El Reno, Oklahoma. Since Rick's last name was La Reno, somehow it seemed fitting that we should stop over in El Reno for a spell. We hit the road again with a different attitude about Oklahoma folk, smile on our faces, and enough El Reno water to last us all the way into Arizona. Somewhere in Arizona, we had just finished the last drop, and we got another shock. We were driving along for miles on standard blacktop and listening to Jimi Hendrix on the tape deck. It was during some forgotten cut by Hendrix that he exclaims the line, "I'm finally on a red road." Now, whether this is exactly what he said or whether we thought that's what he said, it doesn't really matter, because at that exact moment, the Arizona Highway Department had decided to start using red gravel to build the road, and the road was red as far as we could see. We were in shock and awe. Hendrix had been known as an electronic shaman, but this was a little too much like a miracle for us. How much of a miracle didn't surface until years later when Rick and I were living in Berkeley, California. I was watching the nightly news when the talking heads started to make an announcement about El Reno, Oklahoma. Rick and I stood spellbound as the news anchor explained that the water supply in El Reno, Oklahoma naturally contained a high concentration of a mineral known as lithium. This mineral is used as a psychiatric tranquilizer, and the local water contained enough of it to explain why everybody in El Reno was so darned eager to please strangers. I can't forget the fact that they were just real nice folk to begin with, lithium or not. It also explained why we were so cheerful drinking that water all the way to the Red Road in Arizona. I figure miracles aren't bound by any particular time frame. Parts of them seem to show up long before the miracle actually occurs. Other parts don't happen until long after you figure the miracle is over. Sometimes they even show up while the miracle is taking place. This is the rarest event. And when it occurs, we often notice that a miracle is happening right before our eyes. On the road to Mexico. Not long after the water of El Reno lost its effect, we found ourselves driving through Flagstaff on glare ice, heading straight down the side of a mountain. From here, we continued on to California, through Malibu and up to Berkeley. After hanging out with friends in Berkeley, we set out for Pismo Beach. Pismo had always been one of those places on the map, much like Lawrence, Kansas. By that, what I mean is the town is so nice and the people so friendly that you can get stuck there even though you meant to be somewhere else. This had to be at least the second time that Rick and I got stuck in Pismo. First time, Rick almost landed in jail for helping the locals steal the giant concrete clam sculpture in the middle of town and burying it on the beach just before the annual Pismo clam digging contest. It was David Freer that got Rick into deep doo-doo with the clam. David had used the local tow truck, and with the help of a few other local folks, they managed to hook the clam to the back of the tow truck and drop it into a giant hole they had dug on the beach. When the local cops found that the town mascot was missing, all hell broke loose. The story of Arlo Guthrie and the garbage at Alice's restaurant is only the warm-up band for the big Pismo clam caper. Before it was over, I believe David spent time for it, and the only reason Rick stayed a free man was because Freer took the rap for him. There are 4 words that say everything there is to know about Dave Freer. Whatever's right, man. Okay, so it looks like 3 words, but whatever's a compound word and a contraction of is. 3, 4, 5, like Dave would say, hey, whatever's right, man. Folks in Pismo fed us, and in return for our music, they even set up a gig at the VFW post so we could pass the hat for traveling money. Time away from music was spent on the beach, drinking red wine, watching the phosphorescent plankton of the red tide roll in. Red tide is bad for digging clams, but it is pressure sensitive and it glows when it's agitated. Tops of the breakers and footprints on the beach surf line will glow in the dark. The first time I turned around to see my own footsteps glowing in the sand, I near flipped out. Eventually, the good folks of Pismo released us to continue on our journey. Mexico beckoned, and there was still plenty of adventure waiting for us, and our destiny was cinnamon rolls. Stranger things than giant clam capers and phosphorescent footprints awaited us along 101 on the way to Santa Barbara, California. Truck driver from hell. It is possible that demons are real. I am sure that I've dated a few. But that is a story for another time and another place. I want to tell you about a truck driver that went beyond crazy at the point of being a sinister being. We were driving south down Highway 101, headed for Santa Barbara, and smoking some of the fine weed that the Pismo Beach people had laid upon us. All three of us were in a cloud when Rick turned to me and asks if I heard the beeping sound. Told him I didn't notice one, but since he was driving, I'd investigate for him. Sure enough, once I stopped to pay attention, I heard it too. It was a steady beep, beep, beep. It's coming from behind us. When I turn around, I see a large box van with a crazy-looking guy at the wheel. He's driving with his elbows. He's holding a pad of paper in one hand and a pencil in the other. The guy is pointing at the pad, pointing at us with a pencil. He repeats this gesture over and over again. All the while, he's blowing the horn in a steady beat with his elbow. I cannot overstate the look on the guy's face. Classic Hollywood depictions of demonic possession would be about as close as I can come. Okay, so I'll admit, we were really stoned. I mean, Cheech and Chong wasted. So high, we couldn't even figure out that the beeping sound behind us was a guy in a truck. But the fact that we had a beeping truck driver on our ass with a pencil and paper, and he looked like 7 hangovers, was real. Now, because we were so wasted, it took us a while to figure out what the guy was trying to say to us. Rick says, "What's with him, man?" At first glance, I couldn't figure it out either, but eventually it dawns on me. Oh, he's trying to tell us that he's writing down our license plate number. It took me a while. I finally figured out he was doing this because he'd seen us smoking that joint. Stone paranoia often answers questions quickly, even if the conclusions drawn are dead wrong. The driver can see that we've figured out his message. Instead of backing off, he becomes even more agitated and begins driving on the shoulder of the road. At this point, he is actually leaning out of the truck, driving with one hand and pointing at us with the other. As if we didn't get the picture, he pulls up next to us on the shoulder, doing 60 miles an hour, growing red in the face, all the while yelling and pointing. We were sure this scene could not get any stranger when the guy suddenly pulls the truck off the shoulder and onto the grass, doing 60 miles an hour. He continues heading down the bank from the highway, crashes through a farmer's fence, and continues off into the pasture until he disappears into a grove of oak trees. All the while, he continues the beeping, pointing, and hanging out the window. What can you say or think to something like that? What the fuck is what comes to my mind until I come up with something wittier. We spent hours rewinding this event to see if any of us saw something that the others hadn't. The major details of the event appear to have been about the same for all three of us. I didn't expect anyone else to believe this story, because it happened to me, and I can scarcely believe it. You just can't make up stuff that strange. Fiction always falls short of the stuff that actually happens in our lives. Who needs lies when the truth makes a better tale? Taco hell. Eventually, we made our way down to Laguna Beach and met up with the Benedict sisters. These ladies had gone to the same Midwestern high school that Bruce and I had attended. Our parents had moved them out to the West Coast, and our past association made them a perfect connection as a place to hang out. Eventually, Mr. Benedict tossed us out on our behinds for smoking pot in his house, but it was a nice stay while it lasted. I can't say I blame the guy. Why he put up with the bunch of long-haired musicians getting loaded and hanging around his house and hitting on his daughters is really beyond me. I would have told us goodbye even before we had a chance to say hello. It was here in Laguna Beach that I got my first taste of body surfing. Taste is really the proper word for the experience, because I ate everything on the beach on the first wave in. The second wave left me with sand and gravel in my crotch that was still there about a week later. On the way back from this frolic, Rick and Bruce were hungry. I probably needed food too, but nothing looked good after eating half the beach at 30 miles an hour. The famous taco chain, what's his name? Taco Hell, Taco Smell, something like that. We didn't have these in the Midwest as yet. Bruce and Rick both insisted that they had to eat at Taco Smell. I must have had better intuition. I buggered out and sat there with Barry Benedict watching Rick and Bruce wolf down bean burritos. They might have purchased something else, but beans was the limit of their finances. Turns out this was a bad move. The beans were tainted. We will never know if it was an accidental rodent dropping in the batch or if some disgruntled employee had unloaded the kitty litter box into the pot. Whatever was in the beans, neither Rick nor Bruce could keep it down or up, depending on which end was acting up at the moment. Eventually, it reacted to both ends at the same time, and the term the human lawn sprinkler was coined. The guys were so sick, I was afraid our adventure might come to an early end. The recovery took about 2 days, and on the third day we were back on the road again, looking over our shoulders to make sure that Mr. Benedict hadn't called the state troopers on us. Joel Espinosa. Getting evicted kind of lit a fire under our butts, and we decided it was time to get serious about heading to Mexico. We made our way south through L.A., where the air was so polluted that the car headlights were red and orange until we got within a city block of them. We found a place to crash at Rick's aunt. This was the same aunt that had sent the book for Christmas about Mexico. This book, above all things, was the item that sealed our fate on this trip. We learned never to argue with synchronicities like this one. Whatever's right, man. In the morning, we petted his aunt's pet sheep in the yard and took off for San Diego. I guess we took this route because we wanted to get close to the border as possible before actually deciding where to enter the country of Mexico. We had no idea where in Mexico we were headed, so the plan was pretty much open. From San Diego, we decided to head east to Route 98. This road used to be called the Border Friendship Route. These days, it probably has a big stupid fence with gun towers and floodlights. Eventually, we found ourselves in Nogales at the border. We successfully made our way through customs with a 6 months visa and a promise that we would not leave the Valiant in Mexico if it blew up. At that time, we had no idea how close of a shave it would be when it came to our promise with the car. The only reason that they were willing to give us a 6-month visa stay is because we insisted we were going to work in Mexico. We used the address for Raul Martinez, Rick's parents' gardener, as our destination. So south we went with no intention of ever doing a lick of work harder than lifting a taco. As we hit the outskirts of Nogales, we started to get serious about our destination. All we had to guide us was one of AAA's books on travel in Mexico and a compass. As it happens to people, when they cast their fate to the wind, a direction found us. We were about 15 miles into Mexico, and we saw 2 hot and thirsty-looking locals thumbing a ride south. They looked pretty safe, so we decided to pick them up, continued south. Language was a problem, and we spoke no Spanish. The most normal-looking guy, named Joel, spoke only a small amount of English, and as it turned out, his traveling companion didn't speak much Spanish or English. At least that's what Joel claimed. His buddy was a Tarahumara Indian who routinely consumed large quantities of peyote. If Joel told the story straight, the guy spoke an Indian tongue that nobody else understood, and otherwise he would just sit there and smile and mumble strange words to Mescalito. After a while, we managed enough communication to understand that the peyote gobbler was headed for Guaymas, but Joel was headed for Michoacan. Now, we didn't understand much Spanish, but we knew all about Michoacan. This was the state where some of the best pot in Mexico was grown. Rick and I put our arms around Joel's shoulder and said, "Joel, old buddy, we're taking you all the way home." Joel had no idea why we had suddenly become so friendly, and we had no idea how far a trip to Michoacan really was. For everyone, this was ignorant of the situation, and ignorance was bliss. That evening, we found a spot to pull off into the desert and make camp. The night air was cool and clear. You could see every star in the sky that might be visible from that point on the earth. I decided a bit of firewood would be in order. Now, wandering around after dark in Chicago isn't without its risk, but heading off into the Sonoran Desert at night is probably worse. We had no axe, so I had to break wood by hand. I found a dead shrub and began breaking off some branches by bending them till they snapped. One limb was particularly strong, and it took all I had to get it loose. When it came, I lost my balance. I went stumbling backwards into the dark until a barrel cactus broke my fall. This particular plant has spines that are very stiff and curved like a fish hook. From the way I screamed, everyone else was sure I'd gotten clawed by a cougar. The reality wasn't far off. For years I would tell people that the rake marks on my back were from Mexican wild women or from a wild cat. At least the Mexican part and the wild part were true. Eventually, we got a fire made and put up a tent. We were all so tired, and it was time to work out sleeping arrangements. We had a 3-man tent, and we had 2 car seats. Rick and I chose the tent, and our hitchhiking friends took the car seats. Bruce was feeling exhilarated by the stars and the fresh air, so he announced he would sleep on the roof of the Valiant. Rick and I both warned him that that was going to get him soaked. But he laughed at us and claimed, this is a desert. Where's water going to come from? How can I get wet? In the morning, we didn't need an alarm clock. The sound of Bruce's swearing and shivering from the dew got us all out of bed. Between the dew and the laughter, Bruce was already beginning to cultivate an attitude about Mexico. The blimps. Heading south through Sonora and beyond is slow and kind of dull business. Mexican roads are slow to travel by American standards. We had to remain ever watchful for the dreaded burro cart. This is a phenomenon best measured in burro speed. The man driving the car is used to thinking at 65 miles an hour. The guy in the burro cart is used to thinking at 6 miles an hour, the speed that a burro travels. The cart will almost always start onto the road at the point that the automobile is barely able to stop. If the operators of both vehicles could just switch places for a day, they would begin to understand a whole lot more about why burro carts get hit. Burro speed is one of the most important speed limits in Mexico. There's one other speed limit on this trip that we were yet to learn. This limit is what we call blimp speed. It was later that day that we first encountered the silver blimps. I had no idea at that point in time that people had Airstream trailer clubs and that these clubs wandered the roads of foreign nations piloted by guys from Poughkeepsie and Little Rock. On Mexican roads, these American aluminum suburban homes on tires are really slow moving, and they move naturally slower than 5 guys with a mission, and that put them right in our way. I think the first time we saw these blimps was during a gas stop in some dusty village where Joel managed to round us up some tacos. He seemed to know somebody in the town, suddenly showed up with ultra spicy mystery meat wrapped in a corn tortilla. We were all really happy about food, but Bruce made the mistake of looking at his. He started asking what kind of meat was this. I warned him not to look, but he wouldn't hear it. I tried to explain that I hadn't seen a cow for 300 miles, so it was probably a goat or something. I assured him that they didn't eat dogs in this area. Bruce freaked out at the thought of eating a mystery animal, and I got 2 tacos for lunch that day. About that moment, the blimps showed up. They started streaming past us through the town, dozens of them. It didn't take us long to realize that our wide-open Mexican highway was choked with slow-moving silver blimps. We jumped in the car and hit the road before we ended up having to tail the entire convoy. It never seemed to fail that our daily encounter with the aluminum caravan would come on a dreaded Mexican detour. Here we would eat red dust and destroy the car trying to pass blimps across the open desert with no pavement. Mostly passing blimps, spotting blimps, and following blimps seemed to be the high point for several days heading south. We set our clock in the morning to get rolling before the blimps. We would drive hard enough to get distance. This way we could stop for gas and lunch without being passed by a caravan of silver. It was during one of our lunch breaks that we actually decided to eat in a cantina. Funds were limited, so we surveyed the menu for the cheapest item that might fill us up. Turned out that pork tamales were the thing, so we ordered a plate for each of us. The house was filled with locals, and we amused ourselves by watching diners roll their tortillas with a quick 2-handed motion. The tortilla was placed on the flat of the palm of one hand, while the other hand would brush across it from wrist to knuckles and end up with a perfect tube in the opposite hand. Locals got some pleasure out of watching us try to repeat the tortilla roll when ours came to the table. We got nods of approval from around the dining room when we managed a pretty fair attempt. Along with the tortillas, we were also served some pickled jalapeno peppers. I was hungry enough after days of travel that I managed to consume all of the peppers and my tortillas while waiting for the tamales. The restaurant owner had been watching me eat these peppers, and after twisting his mustache for a spell, decided to give me something special. He came to the table with a small wooden bowl filled with fresh raw jalapeno and serrano peppers, along with more tortillas. He placed the bowl down in front of me on the table and exclaimed, "Senor, for you I have some special peppers." I thanked the man and looked down to size up my challenge. The entire room was focused on our table. It would appear that a good joke at lunch must be hard to come by in these parts. I was no stranger to chilies. I grew up in a Polish, German, Italian, and Irish neighborhood in Chicago that was gradually turning over to be Hispanic. The enchiladas in Anita's kitchen always smelled better than my grandmother's pork and sauerkraut. I grew up eating more peppers than most blue-eyed boys when cinnamon red hots were considered spicy fare. Also had a healthy respect for hot peppers, so I rolled my special peppers up in a tortilla one at a time. Only a fool puts a raw serrano in his mouth with nothing around it to absorb the heat. It was pretty hot, but I did well for an American and got approving looks from the diners around me. I thanked the man at the counter for my peppers and proceeded to roll up a second helping. It was at that point that Rick, who had no experience with chilies, says to me, "Hey man, are those peppers good?" I reply that they're pretty hot, but they're nice and fresh. Before I can stop him, Rick lifts a pepper from the bowl, pops it into his mouth, and begins to chew. The reaction was almost immediate and totally dramatic. Rick's eyes bug out, his face turned shades of purple, and he looked as if somebody just stuck a large firecracker in his mouth and lit the fuse. He actually blew over backwards in his chair, so he was laying flat on the floor with his hands around his throat, screaming, "Agua! Agua!" This all happened so fast that it was as if a rocket engine in his mouth had just blown him over from the thrust. The entire room was in hysterics. This was what they wanted to see. If I couldn't give it to him, at least Rick could. Bruce was laughing his ass off as he hands Rick a glass of water. The water is gone in 5 seconds and turns into steam on Rick's tongue. The man at the counter is also out of control with laughter, but he manages to bring an entire pitcher of water for Rick to drink with our tamales. We barely get the tamales down when the first of the silver blimps drives past in front of the cantina. With smoke still coming out of Rick, we bid our audience farewell and hit the road once again for another thrill-packed afternoon of passing blimps. By the time we got the car on the road, there must have been 50 blimps in front of us. There was nothing we could do except try to pass every blimp in sight. We spent most of the day trying, but in the end it was the blimp caravan that gave us our reprieve. The group began to pull over off the road outside of Wymus and circle the wagons for the night. This was the end of the line for our Mescalero hitchhiker, and we pulled over long enough to let him out of the car. We never knew what his name was. I don't think Joel knew either. We spent the rest of the evening driving as fast as possible and as far as we could. We never did see the cursed silver blimps again.